I'm Annabel. I started out as a computer programmer, and now I really don't know what I do. A few years ago, I landed into working in The Guardian as a programmer building in-house tooling for journalists and getting the news that you love to read out there. A regular job, like 9 to 5 and 100 nerds and a lot of very passionate journalists. In 2013, I did something completely different. I applied for a really strange fellowship and ended up working for a year with this lot. We were distributed around the world into different newsrooms, so I ended up in Germany, which is now where I live. I live in Berlin. In case the accent is confounding you, just like wave your hands and I will slow down. I'm from New Zealand and the accent is hard to get rid of. Okay, so the deal is with this fellowship is it's run by OpenNews, and for 4 or 5 years they ran embedding half a dozen people into newsrooms around the world, and we would collectively collaborate on like problems that that affected journalism. And we would travel around and meet communities in the world, in Argentina or Colombia or Western Europe or the US. And we would help these communities solve some of the things that they were doing. Which gets me to why I now work in this intersection between technology and journalism. So you think maybe this intersection only includes the CMS, yeah, maybe. But it also includes a whole lot of other things like document processing, things for like leaks. All the leaked documents that you hear about involve a huge amount of document processing. Other kinds of computer-assisted reporting and data analysis and visualization and all of these things. And there's, I don't know, 8,000 people in the world who do this and enjoy it and work with newsrooms or near newsrooms or on the side of their tech job. And there's a community out there called Hackers who run meetups in this intersection. In every other city that you have been to with a major newsroom, there's probably a community running a meetup called Hackers, which is this intersection between journalism and technology. So hacks is the weird old English term for journalist or stringer, and hacker, we all know, right? Know and love. I help run this community in Berlin, have been doing that for 4 years. And now you wonder how I got to like talking about open source and conflict zones. So after this crazy fellowship ended, I knew a lot of people around the place. And one group of them was a project called Defy Hate Now, and they are running in South Sudan. They mostly run workshops around peace building. Does anyone here know anything about South Sudan? Okay, a little bit. Okay, so in 2011, they became an independent country. They have been in conflict and civil war through that independence until probably very far in the future. There's about 12 million people who live in South Sudan, and I don't know, 4 million of them are now refugees, either in their own country or in other countries, often in large camps. There are 200,000 people displaced just in a UN camp in Juba, which is the capital. The UN didn't have to open their doors, but they did when the conflict erupted again, open their doors and suddenly had a lot of people that they were looking after. Aid agencies don't typically do this, so it's very unusual, and so now there's a lot of people there in limbo, right? This is Stephen. He is the reason why I ended up in Juba. And he runs a little agency called Rogue Agency, who gets German government funding mostly to do community building, peace building, culture projects, some of which revolve around hackerspaces and makerspaces and things like this. So as a part of this peace building, I went to Juba with Stephen to work with the local makerspace to see what it is that they were doing and what they wanted to do and how that could lead into other peace building kind of activities. South Sudan has been torn apart by this conflict. There are very few services and no real willingness on the part of the government to build infrastructure because they basically are a militia. They are one of the sole employers in the country, and if you want to work, you can work for aid agencies or the government, and the government is a huge part of the conflict. The conflict is driven tribally, not religiously. So the ruling party is predominantly made up of one tribe. So the conflict on the ground is driven in this very tangibly awkward and terrifying manner, whereby if you're not of the tribe that's in the ruling party, you're kind of a threat, and people will use hate speech to drive you from your villages if you're reading Facebook, and they will drive you from your villages with guns if they get there if you haven't already left, right? So they're really using the internet and guns to promote this conflict. The internet penetration is like 12%, and loads of people just have phones. You wonder if the internet really matters in a place with internet penetration of 12%, and I tell you that it does, absolutely, because communities build up around these amazing underground communication networks of people who have connectivity, helping people who don't have connectivity. So if you put a phone inside a refugee camp in Juba, 300 people know what's happening by that phone because they're helping each other, as you do. Okay, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about how Juba looked to me, and then I can tell you what projects that I was involved in, and then maybe you can ask some questions if you had any. Okay, so I stayed in a place that looked like a mansion with a massive satellite dish. So I had internet, power, running water, a great bed to sleep in. There aren't that many buildings in Juba that look like this, so I was living it up large. This is a place where journalists come and hang out, actually. They come meet other people, so a lot of information gets traded here. And because it has power and internet, people come also to charge their phones and talk and chill. When we weren't in that building, we were in this building, which is where some of the journalists that we were meeting lived. The spaces in between these two buildings are hard to travel, and we had a van, but it wasn't armoured, and we had no security. We're just a little agency, so we were driven by our mates and to their house, and hung out. A little bit of the difficulty with going to the people's houses is that if you have people who are coming out of the displacement camps or a woman, actually they don't want to travel after 5, or maybe they can't get back into their camp if it's after 5, so our days are pretty short and during daylight, and to try and keep everyone safe. So even though we're here and the space is pretty safe, things aren't evenly safe across a geography or time. So this is a a gasoline stand. So if you want to buy gas for your car, you can buy it by the litre. A lot of people sell gas on the streets. A litre is a nice small amount of gas to buy, and it can power your motorbike, which is the predominant form of transportation if you're not walking around. And they call these taxis bora bora. This is a place where people are like refilling their bora bora bikes and charging their phones with solar power. There's a great portion of Juba doesn't have any power at all. So these kind of charging stations pop up and you pay to charge your phone. In most of the places I was in, we had electricity for about a third of the time and generators for the rest. The UN pumps water out of the rivers to distribute into the cities. I don't know if they treat it, because the trucks that said treated water and the trucks that said just water were the same trucks in the same space, picking up water out of the river, driving directly into town. So if you want to distribute your water to local villages, they're mostly done by bike. Bora bora driver, I didn't travel much, just in a van, so I never had the pleasure of hanging off the bed of a motorbike, although I really wanted to. Okay, so the infrastructure isn't so great, and but there are a lot of communities who are amazing and want to help out. These communities are often run by people who have had their education paid for outside of the country. They've gone to Kenya or sometimes even the US, and they've finished their university education and they've gone back to try and help their country. They can't necessarily get an education inside the country with any kind of feasibility because the schooling system and the university system is not well funded, and you need some money to get there, and sometimes the classes can't run because of the conflict. So if you can get an education out of the country, you do. So this is a local community group where the PSAC camp ran, which is how my colleague Stephen Kovacs managed to meet a whole lot of the community members who I'm going to talk about shortly. Okay, if you're wondering why a lot of the photos are just like, hey, a river, you can take a lot of photos in South Sudan if you just be careful not to be picked up by local security. But don't take a photo of military assets. So there's a pump about just out of shot that I can't show you a photo of. It's a water pump, pumps water to the local beer brewery, but it's a military asset, and they don't want you to take a photo of a military asset. So it's a river. So J-Hub was my first introduction to the local makerspace. And this is the lovely people inside this space. They mostly make movies and work with software. They don't have very much access to hardware, so they do what they can. And they try and teach the local community interesting things about software and hardware. It is a difficult space in South Sudan between aid, which drives a huge amount of money into the country, but only into specific areas. The military, which holds a lot of money to itself, and the people, which are often poor and hungry, but keen to do the things that they are passionate about. The aid agencies tend to do things like build a computer lab but don't put computers in it, or build a computer lab and put a sign outside and have proprietary software that no one has ever seen before made by a cell phone company and then leave people to it. Like, just because these are statement pieces, they're not necessarily there for the people. So if you're a makerspace and you want to actually help your community, you need to kind of get some funding from somebody to help you buy some stuff for your community, and then kind of know how to work within an ecosystem that doesn't have power all the time, and the internet is kind of expensive, and mostly everyone's working off prepay, so you have to distribute data how you can, often by foot, on a USB stick. So one person grabs some stuff and then you hand it around your community. Talking about open source in a space like this, like if you want to build a thing and you want to make money, open source doesn't work for you. Like you want to be able to sell it to somebody and buy some food and live your life and make the things that you love. So open source is mostly relevant in a conflict zone around things that you can use that are inexpensive or free. They're not necessarily about intellectual property. These are the journalists that I work with, and we gave everyone a computer and a phone, and we talked about internet security and privacy, and we collected and categorized hate speech to see if we could use this information to help feed into like workshops that we're running around hate speech. So we collected data programmatically, and then we looked at the impact of tribal conflict on the ground, indicators of conflict, and then tried to give trainings around how to like understand what hate speech is, and is it targeting you, is it real, is it made up? If you get a letter from a government office that says like, we're going to come and trash your town, like is it real? How do you differentiate between real information and fear mongering? And does it matter at the end of the day if you're probably going to be driven from your home anyway? So there's huge need to kind of understand what's happening on the ground, and not a lot of mechanics by which to do it, but this team here is pretty keen. One thing I could say is that you can talk about internet security and privacy in a place like South Sudan, but people are mostly afraid that when national security is coming, they're just going to come to your door and that'll be that. Like there's no real fear that the internet is going to be better or worse for making that happen. Like maybe you keep your identity private if you're a blogger and you say something contentious, but the media is really heavily regulated and people are very, very, very careful at all times about what they do and don't say for fear of the government. Okay, I'm not sure if I'm just rambling now. Okay. So we have a huge infrastructure problem and a bunch of communities who want to use whatever tools that we have to go further. And this is where I met the Go Girls, ACT crowd. So Yanni and Eva work at the local university, and they are lecturing in computer science. So they are just like us, except in a education system that isn't helping them get to their job every day, let alone helping students get to their classes every day. They run a group where they have half a dozen or a dozen mentors, and they go out to local schools with a computer. So every mentor has a computer, and they go out to local schools, and they run mentoring programs for students in order to learn tech literacy and a little bit of Scratch and some other kind of programming skills. And they've run a competition annually or they've run a competition once in order to showcase like a winning project internationally. And so they've got quite a lot of excitement from these crews. Because there's such a limited amount of technology, the mentor goes with a computer to a group. The group has a computer, and one group, one computer. to work with whatever their project is. They often highlight things like they tell stories around domestic violence or the conflict or peace building. Some of the most charming projects. Actually, when we were on campus, we were stopped and interrogated, and even though they had IDs, it was still pretty intimidating because we weren't believed. So university staff on university grounds being interrogated for being on campus, even though it's their job and they're there. I have a list of projects, but I feel like maybe I just talk about a couple of them. So OpenNews didn't start in South Sudan. It started in Tanzania, and it didn't help with conflict. It helped with farming. So OpenNews is an open source project that allows people to take photos and record audio messages, and then send it up to a specific URL, which can be consumed by the community. And what is amazing about it is it's doesn't require any literacy for consumption or creation of any of these messages. So you don't have to be able to read the language or any language in order to create your messages to your community. And because it's language agnostic in this way, actually it can be deployed into different communities. So OpenNews is doing really well in Tanzania. And Eugenio, who created it, partnered with some of the local peace builders in South Sudan in order to deploy that project there. And I can't show you any of the photos because all the photos I have actually show everybody's faces. But they're taking photos of people's hands, often with messages written on them, peace messages, or signs, or just hands, with audio messages to talk about peace. And because of the tribal conflict, people's clothes and facial markings can often give away their tribe. So people are trying to take photos of things that don't give away a person's tribal identity, let alone their identity. So, like, very carefully trying to work around this security and privacy issue. In order to promote peace. So these messages go up and then get circulated around social media, and some of our journalists go out into the field to try and take these messages from people who would otherwise have no access to the internet, in order to demonstrate a more holistic voice for more generalised voice for those communities. Because I think if you only have the 12% that are connected to the internet, you're probably targeting quite well-off people, and there's a huge disconnect between those wealthy, university-educated people who've probably had some education outside the country and the ones that are in rural areas. They work with another project called ESCO Tech, where they've produced, so this is all under this culture agency, Rogue, and they've produced a hardware kit that helps do hardware literacy, and they build phone chargers, solar phone chargers, and these kits are deployed out between the refugee camps and Juba. So the J-Hub community that I showed you earlier was how I was introduced to the makerspaces locally. But when the conflict kicked off again in the middle of 2016, we could no longer get into the country to train or to help with any of these communities. So we started flying the community members out of South Sudan into Rwanda or Kenya and training them there. And some of the people from the local hub that we brought out to Rwanda went back and created another hub So there's now 3 spaces running in Juba, working to increase tech literacy, talk about peace building, work with the field guides that this organisation has created. Yeah. So my experience was mostly to build hate speech collection software and work with journalists to help them understand the local impacts of the hate speech and try and understand how the hate speech was impacting them locally. So joining up communities. And then work with, like, getting people software and hardware across borders so that they could make the things that they want and run the communities that they have.